So my name is Adam Engebretson. I work for a company based in Dallas. We write medical practice management software, mostly in Laravel, which is really fun. I love Laravel. I gave a talk on it in March. If you haven't heard of it, go check it out. I'll show you a tiny bit today as well. But today I'm here to talk about Docker. Now the first thing I'm going to tell you is I do not consider myself qualified to be up here giving a lecture on Docker. But we're gonna wing it. This is what I have to show you is basically based on my experience in playing around with it, and that experience, however, has gotten me to the point where I do feel comfortable to ship services into production at my company, which is something we've just started doing. So I'm getting there. So this will be interesting. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is what the heck is Docker. In short, think about you've got a bunch of different software that needs to run in the cloud, right? But you guys are sick of paying your DigitalOcean or Amazon Web Services bills, so you go out and you get a colo. And did you guys know SpringNet has an underground colo here in Springfield? That's cool. I just found that out recently. So you need to run all these different pieces of software. And you've got one big, fat, heavy-duty machine sitting at your colo. And yeah, you could do, I think it's called an Essex box, where you would virtualize many virtual machines on that hardware, which is one way to approach things. The downfall to that is you end up with multiple operating systems running on your same piece of hardware. Docker, in effect, eliminates, so here's the illustration. So you've got this would be your colo, infrastructure would be your colo, host operating system would be the server that's running the Essex box, and the hypervisor is virtualizing your multiple virtual machines on that container. And then you got this big old section of guest OS, and that is going to be your Ubuntu or your CentOS or whatever you decide to run inside that virtual machine. And then your app at the top, a little bit. So you have all this overhead of the guest operating system running several instances of that on your hardware. Docker eliminates that, in short. There are a lot of gotchas, a lot of nuances, a lot of differences, a lot of similarities to virtual machines. But the biggest noticeable difference is the height of my graphic on the screen, courtesy of the Docker engine operating to provide a shared kernel for all of your containers. Instead of your VMs running isolated operating systems, your Docker engine makes it so that your containers or your applications that you'd want to isolate would share a kernel. So that's the beauty of Docker, in short. Now, Mike and I were having a talk yesterday about different uses for Docker. So I guess the first thing I'm going to say is Docker is incredibly versatile. It is not such that you can only run a website or you can only run a piece of software. You can do so many different types of things with Docker because all it does is virtualize an environment with a shared kernel. So if you wanted to create a Docker image that just runs Ubuntu, you can. Now, to disclaim, that container doesn't run upstart and it doesn't run syslog and it doesn't run all the processes that Ubuntu would start when you turn on an Ubuntu machine. But that's kind of the idea, is you can write a container or an image, a Docker image, and I'll define these in a bit, but you can write a Docker image that is more like an operating system or an environment with some PHP and Nginx installed, or you can write your image in such a way that as soon as it turns on, your application is running inside of it. And that would be, I term them environment containers and application containers. Now, obviously, application containers require the environment, so I'd say an application container is just one step higher than an environment container. But again, it just depends on how you want to utilize Docker, how you want your deployment strategy to work, stuff like that. So to create a Docker, I love Mike. I'm sorry, I gotta make fun of you. He's like, "What is a Docker? How do you make a Docker?" Sorry, it's the wrong verbiage. What you do is you create a Docker image, and a Docker image is a template. Consider it somewhat like a Git repository in that it is a state of being that contains the most recent state, okay, of, in this case, your Docker image, and that would consist of the file system and all the configuration that kind of goes along with Docker, and we'll cover a little bit of that later. So this is how we could create a Docker image. And you can see that we're going to inherit Ubuntu 14.04. You can call from scratch in your Docker file, and it's got nothing in it. And in fact, the Ubuntu Docker image does extend, or does use from scratch, and they just extract their file system in the root of the container, or of the image rather. Maintainer, completely useless directive. Run. So you can see here in this Docker file, this is what we're using to create a Docker image. Which can then be started into a container, which is what actually would serve your application. So to create this image, we can run any kind of CLI commands we need to. Run apt-get upgrade and update, install commands. You can do curl commands, assuming curl is installed. This is similar to a provisioning script on a production server. So if curl isn't installed, it's not going to work, but you can just run apt-get install curl. Then the next command can be run curl or whatever. You can add files. You will build this locally on your machine. And if you're in a directory that has some files alongside the Docker file, which, by the way, it's called Docker file with capital D, no extension. That's the file name that you use. You can copy files from the present working directory into the container, into the image. All sorts of things. You can expose ports and define volumes, and we'll get into those a little bit later. Exposing a port makes it such that the Docker engine expects you to map, in this case, port 80, to any particular port on the host that you're running. So if you wanted, you could map port 80 on your host to port 80 inside your container. And that'd be typical for like Nginx or any kind of web application, really. If you had a container that's running a MySQL database, it would be port 3306. If it was Mongo, oh gosh, I shouldn't have said that because I don't know the Mongo port. You get the idea. As far as volumes go, interesting thing about a container, or about Docker, is if you create an image, again, that's a template, that's a starting file system inside of a virtual environment, essentially. You will then start a container from that image, and the container is an instance. And that instance runs or will stop depending on how you have your system running. But as that container exists, the file system inside of it will persist. But you should still consider the file system inside your container as ephemeral, meaning if I were to delete this container, which you need to do in order to change a port map, or to change a volume mount, or to upgrade to a newer version, you need to delete your container, which means the entire file system of that container is lost. So if you have an application container that has a storage directory where your pictures are uploaded when the user uploads their picture to your blog or to your Instagram clone or whatever, those files would be lost. So exposing a volume like this allows you to say, okay, well, I want this volume, this directory on my host, to be mapped into this directory inside the container. And it mounts that directory so that when the container is destroyed, that directory that has all your user content is still sitting on the host. So that's one way to accomplish persistence. I'm going to show you another way that's so much cooler. So to run a container, lots and lots of different options here. This is the Docker run command that's provided in the GitLab Community Edition documentation. They provide an official Docker image for the GitLab application, and this is the command they recommend you run. So we're going to run sudo. Notice sudo. The Docker engine, since it needs to be able to expose lower level ports as well as have various access to the kernel, you need to run sudo. So that's something to note. Your Docker engine runs as root. Docker run, the -- detach flag means it doesn't attach the container's application to your terminal so you can continue working. You can set a host name. Publish, that's mapping a port. So the port on the left is the port on the host. The port on the right is the port in the container. So for instance, if we wanted GitLab, instead of to be on port 80, we wanted it to be on port 8080, this is the port this is the number right here we would update to 8080. And the application inside the container would still listen on port 80. So that's nice. You get a really large amount of flexibility as far as how you do your port mapping. You don't actually have to go change the software to listen on a different port. You can just update the map here in Docker. Give it a name. Restart always is awfully nice when you don't want your services to be down. So if for any reason your containers will stop, that'll turn it back on. Again, these volume commands, same concept, where the path on the left is the path on the host that is then mounted into this particular path on the container. So in this case, the GitLab config directory, which is mounted into etc GitLab, makes so that if you make a config or make a change to gitlab.rb, it'll persist if you were to upgrade your container, delete it, and start it again for any reason. And then the last line is the Docker image name. That's pulled off of Docker Hub at hub.docker.com, similar to GitHub. Same concept. It's a repository where your images are located. Colon is a tag. We've got latest there, but you can choose a version number typically. Like with this one, I chose Ubuntu 14.04, but you can get 15.04 and 12.0 whatever, and you can get all these different tags, and they just represent different builds of that image. Now, imagine you're developing and you're in the process of getting your Docker container ready to go, and you're constantly rebuilding your image from the Docker file, and then you want to run your container to make sure it works. Obviously, this command's annoying. Am I right? It's a really long command. Enter Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a nice little CLI. I believe it's written in Go, actually. It's a nice little CLI that's distributed by Docker, the Docker Foundation, or whoever they are. And it allows you to convert all of those CLI flags into a YAML file and then run Docker Compose up. And the -d flag means detached, so it's, again, not going to attach to your terminal. Much nicer way to manage your services. Not to mention, you can put multiple container configs in here and tell it that, oh, I want GitLab running, and instead of using the database that's built into the GitLab image, let's use this MySQL database instead, and then you can link them and a bunch of cool stuff. But this, with Docker Compose, you can create this one YAML file that defines all of your services, and then run up, and they'll turn on. Still room for improvement, in my opinion. I'm the kind of guy who hates using the Git CLI. I do not use the MySQL console. I'm a GUI person, constantly using a GUI. And so that's where Rancher comes into play. Now you'll notice I went really, really fast through all the fundamentals. That's because we're going to get into the good stuff and actually showing you what can be done. And Rancher's going to make that really easy. It's a private container service, so essentially what that means is it's similar to running your own version of DigitalOcean, except for with your containers. I know Amazon has a container service, Google has a container service where you can do something similar. Rancher is something you run on your own host, and it's amazing. Services, resource management, container networking, service discovery, container load balancing, health checks and recovery, upgrade, and store management. A lot of fancy words for it, makes it hella easy. That's it for slides, because I hate slides. So let's look at Rancher. If I can have my cursor back. So I like winging things, so we're going to be winging this together. Now, one of the things I'm going to tell you is that I am very technologically ignorant in a lot of areas. I consider my technical expertise to be in a very niche space. Even within the PHP world, even though I consider myself a PHP developer, if you put me in front of a CodeIgniter source code base, I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't have a clue. I am a Laravel guy. Complete aside, Laravel is so freaking easy. If you're a PHP person or if you're interested in PHP, look at Laravel. The only downfall to Laravel, and Mike, I think you can attest to this perhaps, is that the Laravel community has grown the PHP community as a whole, but we're still a niche group. So it's creating and breeding a generation of developers who are very limited in their knowledge because they know Laravel. And Laravel has kind of obfuscated some of the complexities of PHP. Anyway, sorry. So my ignorance. I don't know what language Elasticsearch is written in.
Java.
Thank you. I had no idea. No idea. And I still have a full Elasticsearch suite running. And it's running I've got this KOPF cough. This is simply something that you can get with Elasticsearch, and it shows you your cluster. You can see I have 3 data nodes running, so those are actually on 3 different servers at DigitalOcean, and they're running all inside Docker containers. And I had like I said, I don't even know how to install Java, except for when I was dinking around in my Minecraft days.
Through install Java.
I'm on DigitalOcean VMs.
Oh, right.
Production
install Java.
Production web environment. So I wouldn't know how to install Elasticsearch, but the beauty of Rancher and Docker is that you don't really need to know much about the environment in which the application needs to run. What else have I got? I've also got Cabana. Same concept. Cabana is an add-on to Elasticsearch, and it's kind of like a GUI indexer. It allows you to search, and I'll show you really quickly. This is a work one. And it's down right now, so that's fun. Well, that's encouraging. But I can show you. I've got PBX servers. I'm running new phone systems for my clients. These are my logs as they've come into our Elasticsearch. There's just syslog being piped directly into here, and this is something that's just a visualization tool is what Cabana is. Again, I have no idea how Cabana is written, what it's written in, but I have it running in actually 2 production environments right now. I've also got this web stack, and I will get into how these are running. I'm a maintainer of several packages in the Laravel community, and we are collectively the Laravel Collective. See what I did there? This is our website, but it's, and you know, Laravel collective.com, obviously. But I have the same thing running inside of a Docker environment here at web.deliver.io. By the way, all these IP addresses are open. And this Rancher instance is at deliver.io with the 2 V's. The username is SGF. The password is SGF. I'm going to leave it open for a week. So, and I'll comment this on the meetup. So if you guys are interested enough by the time this is done, you can come in. It's a read-only account, so you can just look at all of the config and how it's set up inside here to get some cool ideas. So I guess what I want to do is delete Cabana, delete Logstash, and delete Elasticsearch, because I can. So I've currently got 3 servers running. Oh, let's talk about install. I'm sorry. This repository is also available on GitHub. To run Rancher, which I'm sorry, is just a fancy UI for Docker. I said that. To run Rancher and to install it, you create a virtual machine at DigitalOcean or on your own hardware, or even a physical machine on your own hardware, however you want to do it. 3 steps. 1, install Docker, single line install script there. Install Docker Compose, which is kind of optional. I like to run Rancher with Docker Compose simply because it makes it really slick when they tag a new version and I want to update to the newer version of the image. I don't have to remember where I did my volume mounts or my port maps. I've just run Docker Compose up. So I like to use Docker Compose and then install Rancher. Notice how this is a Docker run command. Rancher itself runs inside of a Docker container. They actually also released something called Rancher OS, which is an operating system where every service on the operating system runs in a Docker container. It's pretty slick.
Do you know if DigitalOcean offers a droplet for that?
They do not. Yeah. So, yeah. I know. It's sad. I haven't even tried it because of that. I can't get it running. But so let's before we dig into what I've got going on here, let's go look at. This is that virtual machine I created at DigitalOcean, and in fact, yeah, here it is. So I'm just going to go into this Rancher directory, and I have this Docker Compose YAML file, so you can see The name of my service is Rancher Server. The image I'm pulling is Rancher/server. The tag I've asked for is version 0.56.1. Rancher Server recommends you listen on port 8080. I don't like that, so I use port 80. So the application inside the container is listening on port 8080, but I've decided to map the port 80 on my host to that port inside the container, so I can change that at any time if I want. Volumes, so I've mounted the directory at, oh good lord. I hit mute and everything.
You had to hear the movie quote earlier, okay?
So I got this MySQL directory here. This is the MySQL database that's running inside the container. It's live. If I were to delete it, my server would go down. But that's because the volume mount I've mapped here. And restart always. Really simple. So if I wanted to update this to 56.2, I would just save that file and then I'd run Docker compose up.
So Adam, if you have multiple Rancher instances that want to listen on port 80, how does that work out? Do they have different IPs or can you not do that?
The idea is that you run one Rancher server.
Okay.
Unless you've got multi-tenant issues,
Right.
then they wouldn't be installed on the same server anyway.
Okay.
Further, Rancher Server is designed to run on its own box and create and provision other hosts for your containers to run inside of. So Rancher Server lives kind of on its own VM, and then it will create and provision more hosts.
And does each host have its own address then?
Yes,
Is that the idea?
because each
Okay.
host is its own VM, or if you have it set up on either if you have an X6 box or if you have hardware machines with their own IP addresses, they to operate a server as a Rancher host, you just have to have Docker installed on it, and you run one command. So if I wanted to add a host, there are a couple ways I can do it. I can do it with DigitalOcean. Good question, by the way. Thank you.
And don't get confused between host and container,
Yeah.
which it might have been, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Which he'll get to multiple containers on one host here in a second.
Yeah. But yeah, the Rancher server is separate by itself. Yes, you could run other Docker containers on that same virtual machine if you wanted, but the way Rancher has been designed to run in production environments is the server itself runs on one virtual
So
machine.
it's making completely separate hosts at Amazon, DigitalOcean, Rackspace, wherever.
Yep, correct.
Yeah.
And then custom too. We've done this a couple times where we have a machine already on site at one of our clinics, and I installed Docker. I ran this command, and all of a sudden it showed up as a host in my infrastructure. So these are 3 different DigitalOcean virtual machines. They're communicating to the Rancher server over DigitalOcean's private DNS, which is why these IP addresses are 10s. But you can see, all I did was add in DigitalOcean. I dropped my API key in here, gave them a name, selected my region, just like you're creating a DigitalOcean box, and I hit create. And then a couple minutes later, they showed up here. It's amazing. Now, these are all the containers I'm running right now. Keep in mind, I just deleted my Elasticsearch, my entire Elk stack out of here. But you can run multiple containers on a single host. That's the beauty of it, is you can have any number of containers running on a host. And I know you were asking about port 80, and that's a really good point, because what if you have 2 websites, I don't care how if they're Python or whatever, again, technical ignorance, I don't know anything about those. If you have two different services that you want to run that you would like to use port 80 for, there is a way to solve that, and I will show it to you in a tiny little bit. But first, I'm gonna show you how easy it was for me to create Elasticsearch, the entire Elk stack. Rancher provides this beautiful catalog of all they are Docker Compose file templates, pretty much. So I can just come in here to the Elasticsearch one. I can select the version I want, give it a name, don't care, give it a cluster name. Here's the answer to your question, by the way. And hit launch. this is going to, and we can actually view the config here. So this is the Docker compose file on the left, which is the same as we looked at in the slides. Obviously much more complicated, a lot more things going on here. And what you see on the right is Rancher compose. It is another YAML file that configures just a couple, holy crap, it was longer than I thought it was. It configures some Rancher specific features that I'm not really gonna get into. But you can see that it's creating 3 different services, and it's actually creating several different services, more than 3, but they have this concept called a sidekick, where if you have one service that requires another service to be running on the same host for whatever reason, a lot of times it has to do with your sharing volumes between the two, you can create what's called a sidekick, and Rancher will schedule those containers across your hosts together. So if you have 3 hosts, it'll put all your 2 services that are sidekicked on the same host no matter what. So as this is creating, you can see the Elasticsearch clients, data nodes, and masters are running. Do you know what those words mean?
Which one?
Clients, data nodes, and masters.
I don't know that it's necessarily an Elastic.
Yeah, I think it's an implementation thing. I'm assuming the masters are like the source of truth, right? And you've got your data nodes, which are sharding your clusters across the cluster. I don't know. I don't know Elasticsearch very well at all. Thank you. I practiced for that one. So now, if we were to go to Kopf, K-O-P-F, it's not going to work. I knew it wasn't going to work. And I'll show you why. And this is going to answer, what's your name?
Jason.
Jason, nice to meet you. This is going to answer your question, Jason. Rancher provides a service called a load balancer. So I could come in here and select add load balancer, and I'd get a bunch of config options. I'm not going to show you how to create one. I'm going to show you how to edit one, because we're going to add routing so that this kopf.deliver.io resolves. DNS is deliver.io points to Rancher server. Any subdomain .deliver.io points to Rancher host 1. And my load balancer is running on Rancher host 1. So trust me on that. So any subdomain is going to come into this load balancer of the domain I'm using. So I've got port 80 for kopf.deliver.io. That's redirecting to an Sslizer I have. If I have time, I will get into it. It's so cool. We can get free SSL certificates really easily through this. But what I'm going to do, so you'll notice that my error message here is too many redirects, but I am at HTTPS even though I didn't type that in. So now we'll have to say if a request comes in to kopf.deliver.io on port 443, which is the SSL port, I want to go to the Kopf service. And that Kopf service is listening on port 80, and I have my SSL certificate already created and configured inside this load balancer. So I'm just going to save that, and ta-da. Jason, yeah? Thank you. So if you had several different services running on a container or on a network of containers, throw them to the load balancer and route by hostname. One of my favorite features. My second favorite feature is I've decided, you notice that these containers are 3 different containers here. They are running on Rancher host 2. I've decided that my Elasticsearch cluster is too wimpy. I'm doing too much work with Elasticsearch. I don't know what you do with Elasticsearch stuff, I guess. So I've got too much searching going on, and for some reason my server's not performing very well. So I've decided I need to scale up my stack. So I hit this big fat scale plus button, and you'll see that I'm now creating an instance of my data node on Rancher host 1, and it's going to have to spin up a couple more containers as well, I think. But if we go here and just wait at kopf, we will see that a node is going to join our cluster, which is great because I don't know how to do that except for with Docker.
It's actually just as easy without Docker. It's incredible.
Shh. I believe you. Yeah, see, it has to spin up because these containers are sidekicked. So if we go back and look at Elasticsearch, I scaled up the data nodes one, and it has 2 sidekicks. Therefore, there are 3 containers on every server that's running this service. So it had to create a total of 6. And so now there are 6, and boom, you can see that our new node has joined the cluster. And I can scale this up and down all day long, and it's awesome. Now, Elasticsearch does volume replication all by its lonesome. And it's pretty cool that it can do that. See, now I've got something on host 1, 2, and 3. And it'll join the cluster in time. Hard refresh when in doubt. So one of the things, though, is if you find yourself needing to replicate your file system across multiple hosts all by yourself, because it's not Elasticsearch data, say it's session data. Say we've got a website that's running, and it's got, there it is. Say your website's running, and users can log into your website, thus creating a session. And so your session is let's say it's stored as a file on your web server. You're going to want the ability to, and you want to load balance your web server across multiple different servers. I'm going to actually upgrade this one really quick. Bear with me here while I make some tweaks to this. I'm going to regret this because I'm not going to remember how to come in and put this back, because I do want to show this as well. There's a software, again, know nothing about it except for how to play with it in Rancher. It's called Gluster FS. That'll do. Actually, I'm going to take a step back. I just did what's called an in-service upgrade. All of the settings that you saw in that composer YAML file cannot be changed on a running container. You have to stop the container and or delete that container and start up a whole brand new one. That process is a pain, especially if you're not using something awesome like Rancher, in which case what you can see is the state is currently upgraded. Now, I've got a health check on this service, meaning it's expecting to receive a 200 status code when it makes a web request on port 80 to the container. There's no source code in there, so it's returning a 404, which is why it says initializing. But other than that, you can see it has the one container that it stopped and the initializing, and if there were source code in there, it would say ready, container that is running. And I'm in an upgraded state, and that's because I changed a bunch of settings. I removed a couple environment variables when I did that upgrade, and I tweaked some volume settings as well. Now, if I say, FML, I just broke it, there's a button for that. They should really have a custom language I can install in here and change the contents of some of these buttons. It'd be useful. So I can roll it back, and it deletes that new container it just created and starts using the old one again. It turns it back on, and you're back to where you left off. Or I could hit finish upgrade, in which case all it would do, and I'm not ready to do it because I'm not sure it worked, all it would do is just delete this old one. And then the new config is what would be in place. So what I want to do is I want to actually SSH into this container, and it's not running SSHD. You can't actually SSH into the container, but Docker allows you to attach a terminal to the container. And Rancher gives me a nice UI to do that with. I'm going to install, well, if we go to web, we should see that there's nothing there. Yeah, the load balancer can't reach the service that's running because it's returning a bad status code. So let's do this. I happen to know that my Nginx config file in this particular container, by the way, I built this container. I'll show you the file if you want. I happen to know that the Nginx is looking in this directory, var www public. So I'm going to vim and index.php, and just for proof of concept, I'm still learning vim. So bear with me. We'll go ahead and put that PHP info page, and ta-da. So this is running inside of a Docker container, which is really fun. What I'm going to do instead, though, is install Laravel, because Laravel's awesome. And so, see how it's running? It's because it's now receiving a 200 status code from making a web request on port 80. And as soon as I delete public, if we just wait a second, you'll see it switch back to unhealthy. But in the meantime, I'll say that upgraded successfully. Now it doesn't like me. But let's go ahead and we're going to do... all we're doing here is downloading Laravel. Sorry, this is going to take a little bit of time. But using PHP magic, we're downloading and installing Laravel into this directory. Again, inside the container. Now, if you remember what I said earlier, if you delete the container, file system's gone, right? Likewise, if you have the container running on multiple different hosts, they don't have the same file system because they're on different hosts. And actually, a volume is really just sitting, Docker volume is sitting in like varlib Docker or something like that on the host. And you can relocate that if you want, but that's where it's sitting. So if you've got or the same container running on 3 different hosts because you wanted to load balance your website because you got all the cool traffic in the world, you might find that the file system isn't the same across all of them. But I'm going to demonstrate that in this case it is, because there is a software called Gluster. Gluster FS, again, don't know anything about it. I guess what it does is it makes a network volume. And it's all with Docker. And yeah. Rancher has come out with a service called Convoy, which links into Gluster FS. The beauty of all this is you don't have to know how it works. You just have to know how to use Rancher, and that's the skill set that I have. Is I can use Rancher. I have Gluster FS running inside my environment. That was one of the several things you saw as we looked. Actually, I can come show you my infrastructure. All the containers. I've got Convoy Web, which is that Convoy plugin that Rancher released, and it's talking to Gluster FS, which is right down here, and it's just sharing files, creating what's called a storage pool. Oh boy, if I don't see it there, my demo might be lost. We'll find out in a few. It's supposed to show me here that I've got a volume living inside this storage pool, but I could have done it wrong. So we'll let this finish installing, and then we'll see once this is done that it'll give us a fresh Laravel page. Any questions so far? Oh yeah, say thanks.
This shell, is that part of Rancher, or is
Yeah.
there another web app for the shell?
It's part of Rancher. It's awful.
You don't like it?
I hate it.
But here you are.
Here I am because it's quick and easy.
Okay.
Typically, if you need to do something shell intensive inside your container, what I would do is SSH into the host that it's on, and then attach. You'd run Docker exec with the IT flag, 2 flags, interactive, and open a TTY. Give it the container ID, and just bin bash is the command you would be executing inside the container. So you'd have a full TTY shell.
So does Docker by default start bash, or do I have to tell it bin bash?
You have to tell it bin bash, because a container runs one command. Oh, this is a fundamental I skipped, I'm sorry. A container runs one command. That's its job, just the one. Now that command can spawn sub-processes, of course, but a container, like for MySQL, the MySQL container, the MySQL service is daemonized, is turned off in the config, and the one command that it runs is MySQL. If the MySQL command crashes or terminates for any reason, the container stops. So that's a fundamental.
This is not during the run phase, though.
This is during the run phase.
Because, I mean, I thought you said you could run several.
You can run several containers, but I'm saying one container, its job is to run one command. And like I said, that command can spawn sub-processes or call sub-daemons if you want. And most containers will do that, especially like my web, this container right here, it is doing that. It's running an Nginx daemon and a PHP 5 FPM daemon, but in order to do that, I had to write one command that spawns those. And if that command were to fail, the container would stop.
This is great for setting up servers and managing everything. What about deployments? Is it
Not there yet,
Okay.
but I will get there. I spent a lot of time on it last night. I was up late, just for you guys. Okay, Laravel's running. So one of the things I do have here is chmod 767. Yeah. I'm sure there are great ways to get around this, but there are file permission issues that I have yet to figure out. So great, Laravel's running. And one thing I'm going to do is, first thing I'm going to do is scale this thing up. So what this is going to do is it's going to go ahead and create another container. It happens to be on the same host, and I hate that. Don't know why it does that. Happens to be on the same host, and is, but is a completely separate container, and it can technically has a completely separate file system. But if we SSH in, Laravel's still there. So when we first SSH'd into the first container, Laravel was not there. We created the public directory, and we created that PHP info page. Then we installed Laravel. Well, I just created a brand new container. Whenever you create a container, it's an exact copy of the image, which does not have Laravel in it. So what's amazing here is that we used GlusterFS and Convoy and Rancher storage pools. Excuse me, there it is. Web, it's what I named it, and it's currently, you can see exactly where that particular storage pool is being accessed from. Those two web container instances in var www. So I'm just going to scale this up like 5, 4, 3, 4, 5, 4. Okay. So this is creating multiple instances of my container. Now that load balancer, when we configured the load balancer, we pointed to, actually we didn't configure the load balancer for this, I did earlier. Load balancer. For web.deliver.io, first thing I do is I send it through my Sslizer. The Sslizer has like two things on it. It has Nginx with one virtual host, that's the Apache term, but one server listening. All it does is redirect to HTTPS. And it has a bash script for generating free SSL certificates with Let's Encrypt, which is fun. If you haven't heard of that, Let's Encrypt. They're awesome. So if you go to web.deliver.io on port 80, you're going to get redirected to HTTPS, which is then port 443. And we are pointing at a service. Now, this is the service. This stack web/web service is what we scaled up to 4. But I can't select a container here. I'm selecting the service. Courtesy of Rancher and their amazing networking, they will automatically load balance to all of those containers that are running that service, which happen to be on several hosts. So now that I'm done being scaled up, why does it do that? The scheduling is weird. So it's got 3 on host 1. There we go. Now there's 1 on host 2. So I've currently got 5 containers running the same thing. They have a shared file system, and to demonstrate that, what I was going to do is I'm just going to edit the little home page that it shows me here. And I'm going to do this. Who knows how to duplicate a line in Vim? Yeah.
YYP.
Duh.
Yeah. Thank you. I used to know that. Whoop. And I always hit I before DW. So we're going to do, and this is, the curly braces are Laravel, but don't worry about that. Oh. I'm going to do cache get hits. And I'll show you what I'm doing here in a second. So I'm changing the index.php, or the equivalent of the index.php, to show us, what time is it? Oh, good. To show us the host name of the machine, which, by the way, is the container's name, and cache get hits. Okay, so we're just going to get the quantity of hits out of the cache, and I'll show you how I'm going to access that in a second. And then I'm going to come in here. Oh, did it not like that? No, it did. So that's the host name. If we look at .env, our cache driver is file, right? So, sorry, do my little zoom. Cache driver is file, which means that that cache, that hits number, is saved on a file system, which we haven't created yet, but we're going to go into app http routes, And inside here is where we're going to add cache increment hits. Done. So refresh this, and it doesn't work yet. 1. So that 1 was just created when we loaded this page, and it was created on host 0C8E. If I refresh, we're now on, and it's not working. Why isn't it working? Oh, you know what? It's my health checks. Hold on, let's turn those off. Actually, no, let's just do this. So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to wait. So we're just going to go to test instead. Hits. Okay. So now the health check is no longer interfering with this. But also I'm tempted to think that my thing's not working the way I wanted it to. Okay, here we go. Refresh. You can see that that number increases every time, but the host name changes every time. Not every time, because it's load balanced, and it happens whenever it feels like it. But yeah, I have really simple DNS. I'm just pointing to my load balancer. It takes care of everything, and that file system is what stores, the file system stores that number, and we're just incrementing it every time we hit, get a different host name, shared file system, multiple hosts, multiple containers. Yes?
I just want to make sure I understand the architecture. So there's one Nginx instance that's running in the Docker container, and that's parsing out to all those hosts that are running.
It's an HA proxy, but yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yep.
So you're whatever your load balancer is. And it's hitting all those instances, but because they have shared file systems, that's where the cache is going. That's how you count.
Right. Right.
The
Curse.
file system is the same one as the host that Rancher is running on?
No, because if we look at this service, and I don't know why it keeps freaking out, but I'm running this container's on host 1, host 3, host 1, and host 2. That's just how it's scheduled them. But even though these two are on the same host, they actually have a different container. What's your problem? They actually have a different container file system. Let's calm it down a little bit. Calm it down. One more. Great. Okay. So even though they're on the same physical virtual host at DigitalOcean, they actually have a separate file system because the containers, they have their own file system. But it's that one directory, var www, which I configured, and I know I went over that really quickly, but that's what I configured to use Gluster FS, is that var www directory, which is sharded, and it's actually sharded across all 3 hosts. You can see I've got Gluster FS server, Gluster FS server, Gluster FS server. It's running on all 3 of them. So that file system is not only accessible on all 3 hosts, it's also sharded, replicated across all 3 hosts. So if I could trash a host, then no biggie.
And that's what Gluster FS does. It does the magic.
Yes, that's what Gluster FS is, yeah. Yes?
Can you go over how the load balancer is configured again?
Mhm.
Because I didn't see you pointing anything to the load balancer, but everything's just one board.
Load balancer's listening on port 80, 443, and 5000 on TCP. Don't ask why. So let's go ahead and create a new load balancer. We're going to create this LB test, and I am going to schedule it, and this is how I made it so that the load balancer lives on Rancher host 1, which is why I can point all the DNS to Rancher host 1, is I said the host must have a label of load balancer equals true. You can literally go in and edit a host and add a label to it. It's used for scheduling. So we're going to go ahead and just say that I want this one to live on that host. I want it to listen on port 8080 over HTTP. And then I'm going to add a couple services, and I'm going to show advanced routing options. So what this means is that port 8080 is going to be exposed on my host into the load balancer. the HA proxy, which is going to receive the network request. And then I'm going to say, well, if the host is pickle.deliver.io and it came in on port 8080, I'm going to direct that to web, the web service again, and port 80. Because this service is listening for port 80. So if I save that and start it, pickle.deliver.io port 8080, same thing. So you have to expose the ports on the host when you're creating your load balancer. And that's how requests get routed to the load balancer. And then you configure the load balancer just using their form. It's nothing more than an HA proxy. Do you know anything about HA proxy? I don't, anything, nothing. But all Rancher is doing, I created it as a load balancer in Rancher. I happen to know it's an HA proxy. They tried to white label the whole thing, but all it does is Rancher maintains the config files and all the host names. Oh, Rancher does DNS too, which is amazing. I can have my MySQL server running on this host and my web application running on this host. And as long as I link those two containers, I can just say connect the host name to MySQL instead of localhost. It talks to Rancher. Rancher says, here's a Rancher IP address, which is going to right over here. It does a bunch of amazing networking stuff. You don't have to worry about it. Because every time you create a new container, it gets a new IP address, which is really annoying unless Rancher does it for you. Call it service discovery. I've talked a lot, and I'm kind of out of time, aren't I? Sorry. Any other questions? This wasn't as cool as I wanted it to be. How's the deployment work? Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, so in order to show you deployment, I can't change that. Let's just do that for safety. And I've got all these. I was ready to SSH into every single one.
Can we talk about what we mean exactly by deployment first? Like what aspects?
Okay,
exactly?
yeah, so you have your website built in Git, or you're using Git and your website's contained in that.
Perfect.
And you want to push up to master and kick that sucker up to production.
Here's my Docker file. I'm going to do this really quickly. Here's my Docker file. I'm the maintainer. Cool, right? I used this Fusion base image, and that's how. Oh, I forget who asked. I think what's your name?
Me?
Yeah,
Johnny.
John. Johnny. Nice to meet you. Fusion base image allows you to run those multiple cert daemons like I was talking about. It's just an open source, community contributed Docker image that you can extend and run your own services. So this CMD command is what tells Docker, this is the one command you're going to run when the Docker turns on.
Okay, and so that's distinct from run.
Correct.
Run is sort of.
Run is at the build phase.
Got it.
Yep. So this CMD, that's the command that's going to be run when the Docker container is turned on. And I just followed the instructions on Fusion base image. They say all you have to do is create this file, Etsy service nginx run, and as long as those files exist, it'll boot them up. It's just a convention that their init script does. So that's how I'm able to run multiple things. But what else I have here is the biggest kicker right here, add files /etc to root Etsy. So in the directory I'm in right now, oh man, can you kind of see? Here's my Docker file, and I've got this files directory here, and I've got Etsy, oh, don't do that, Etsy, my initd, and this clone repository. Long story short, again, this is a Fusion base image convention thing. Their documentation says how to run a script at boot up time, at container runtime. And that's what this script does. I'm going to key scan for GitHub and Bitbucket, and this is the deployment question. We're key scanning for GitHub and Bitbucket just so those keys are there. Setting up Composer Home. This environment variable, GitHub token, is something that you can define when you're starting your container. ID RSA, really crappy way to do it. This is a work in progress. Essentially, I'm wgetting the contents of a private SSH key. And I've got one. I created one. I guess the idea is that's kind of okay because the public version of that is going to be sitting as a deploy key with read-only access on your GitHub account. So arguably security by obscurity. Not that my company does that. We don't do any of that. So no. Then it'll execute a pre-install script, again, all driven by environment variables. By the way, this is a script I wrote last night, and this is my deployment script solution. Work in progress. But if an environment variable called get URL is defined, it's going to clone it into var www. Unless you tell it otherwise, it's going to run composer install no dev. Unless you tell it otherwise, it's going to try to make the storage directory writable. It's very Laravel-esque, this particular deploy script, but then it'll run a post install. So if we wanted to see that in action, I'm going to go ahead and delete this LB test. And I'm going to scale down these containers, and I'm also going to disable the Gluster FS because the Gluster FS utilization web server solution is cool for one thing. What I'm about to show you is when the container turns on, it deploys the application into it itself. So they don't agree very well because they would have a shared file system. And yeah. So anyway, I'm just going to disable all of the volume stuff, and then we're going to come in and edit some environment variables. So there's a GitHub token. Here's a Git URL for the Laravel Collective website, and there's my SSH key. All right, fantastic. So now SSH key, ID RSA. I think that's it. I'm going to turn off the health check so it stops.
I got your URL. Is that what you wanted? Instead of your SSH key?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the URL.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's the W.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we don't talk about this. So this is what the health checks look like, just a complete aside. You can tell it to, as long as these rules match, it's pretty slick. It'll just warn you, and you can actually tell it, I want you to recreate the container if it's running as unhealthy or whatever. And what's nice about that is like the image is pretty damn close to what you want your application environment to look like. So recreating it should be really simple. It's not like recreating a new web server like you have to do now where you have to reinstall PHP and apt-get update and you're going to have different versions of it. It's beautiful. In case you got any of that. So we're going to go ahead and run this. So I'm doing an in-service upgrade again on this container. I've scaled it down to 1. I've disabled the Gluster FS. So now each container is going to have its own file system. Now we're going to hurry up and view the logs. So what's happening here is we're now running composer install. We have successfully set some environment variables. We setting GitHub access token, that's a composer thing. Found ID RSA, it's pulling it. Found the Git URL, cleaning up var www and cloning into it, running composer install, blah, blah, blah. And then this is a post-deploy script that's actually configured by Composer. In this particular case, it's cloning all of my markdown files that are the documentation for those libraries that we maintain. And there's one other command I didn't do, and I can fix that with another environment variable.
So when you push up to master, it would automatically download it with updates.
The idea is you'd have to recreate the container, and it would automatically pull and deploy your application from master. So if you want to set up a service hook so that whenever you push to master, it makes a webhook over to your Rancher server, because there are APIs in Rancher that would trigger a rebuild of that container, that'd be possible. I'm new to this, so I don't quite have the perfect automatic deployment solution quite yet. This is what I've got so far. Post install PHP artisan route scan. That's something that needs to be done for the routes to be there. But I mean, the easy solution is, yeah, you push to master and then just go hit delete on your container. And Rancher will be like, oh, shit, where'd it go? Let's create a new one. And it creates a new one, clones your source, runs your composer install, or whatever it is that you non-PHP people need to do.
And I assume also you can fall back to old methods of having some script on your server.
Yeah,
And
that's
custom-made host.
that's all that what I did is. That's all this is. This is just a bash script that's just running. Now you could scrap this whole thing and instead say clone repository. Maybe you'd still want to clone it from the environment variable like I did. So you might want some of this still, but you might clone it and then you might just be like bash deploy.sh. And that deploy.sh is a file in your repository. That could be another way to do it.
But like old school methods, like before deployments got really popular, it would be a common scenario
Why
to
do you
throw a PHP file publicly available that when you hit that, it runs a git pull. So, I mean, if you want to fall back to methods like that, you can as well.
Or we could do something like it.
Still got slash hits on there.
Right. You know,
Ha! Thanks. Hey! And this particular web application, it has a markdown to HTML parser, and on my server I run a cron job that just clones those markdown files in again. And so when you go to one of these pages, it has read the markdown file and rendered this HTML. And in order to do that, it git cloned my source code and then ran composer install, and then it ran another command that cloned all of the branches of that docs repository into a certain spot. So one other cool thing that it did. So that's, and I'm sorry, I wish I had spent more time figuring out how to do deployments, but I'm not there yet. Even at work and what I'm doing in my personal and work stuff, I'm not there yet. This is what I came up with last night, and to be honest, I'm pleased with it. It's very customized to what I need, absolutely. But the idea is that you could very easily build your own Docker image that is designed to deploy your web applications however you need them to. So you could customize this script. Obviously, you might not need PHP and Nginx installed. You might just want a Node.js one, or you might just want a Python environment or whatever. So yeah.
All right, I got 2 questions, and bear with me.
Okay.
I think they'll hit home well. First question requires a simple yes/no answer. Does Docker, is the concept baked into this, that while you have these running out in production, is it meant also to run in development?
Sure.
So the idea being, I'm running on the exact same environment that I'm going to out in production.
Sure.
Okay.
Now, arguably on that note, depending on how you build your Docker containers, again, back to the environment container versus application container, what this is a hybrid of the two. It's an environment container that's designed to automatically turn itself into, if you send the proper environment variables through, an application container. So yes, I could spin an instance of this particular container up and on locally, and then I could attach a bash to it, go in and git clone and edit my Nginx config and volume mount the source code from my machine into the container and just work on my source code, change it, refresh, whatever. Yes, it could be used to host a local development environment. But if your container is designed to, be built with your because you can actually build your container with your source code in it. So in this case, I've just, obviously I've downloaded PHP, Nginx, and a bunch of config, whatever. Instead of adding files etc to root etc in the container, I could add dot to var www in the container. And so this image, once it's built, has my application in it. That's a very, so there are multiple ways to do it. In short, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, case in point being your Elasticsearch example. You admittedly said, I don't know Elasticsearch, I don't know what it runs, I don't know whatever. That's great that it's running out on production, but when you got to develop stuff and actually need to build things, you need that down on your machine. Mm-hmm. So running in that same environment with that ease is appealing. So
yeah,
cool. My second question is this. While all of this, what we saw tonight was really advanced, and that's awesome, it's clear that it's infinitely powerful and you can do tons of stuff in here. For those of you in this room that grasps all this, that's awesome, but I'm willing to bet at least half of us are thinking,
sorry about that.
Damn, when am I going to use this? And my question is this a use case? Is this a valid use case? I've got some PHP sites that I run in a LAMP stack, and then oh, now I want to run some Node site, and there's some Ruby site I want to get up. My workflow right now is there's no way in heck that I'm going to go install that stuff on my LAMP stack where everything is perfectly running. I don't.
Do
want to
you use
them.
Forge only?
Host agnostic. So what?
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
but
so
I've heard other people
you
in there that
protect your lamp stacks
Right,
with everything
yes.
inside you because
Right.
your tool will break if
Yeah,
you.
and you
I know the
so-
feeling.
And I want to get like a Node website up now. I don't want to go install that on a web server that I've got 3 or 4 sites running on that cannot, start messing around with this stuff. Is Dropper then a excellent tool for having one server now where I can quickly go spin up a Node site or quickly spin up a Ruby environment, not having to have a whole other server that I'm paying for monthly?
That is precisely why I got into Docker.
Yeah.
My company, we had this employee who no longer works with us. He wrote this really awesome API suite for managing PDFs and separating them into separate pages and even scanning them for data matrix barcodes. We use it for patient charts. It's amazing. It's written in Go. Nobody in my company knows anything about Go. So we got to the point where it's like, and this script requires a bunch of CLIs to be installed, and I'm very protective of my web servers because I didn't build them, I used a tool to build them, and if somebody screws it up, my tool's gonna break and I'm gonna be screwed. So, and you're coming from the same spot, so that's exactly why I figured this out. I figured out how just enough Go to build the binaries and get it to run inside of a Docker container, and now if we need to run up a suite of that API suite, we can just hit Docker run and it's running, and I don't care about how it's running or Yes.
So can you develop a container that would break another container on the same host?
Can you develop a container that could what?
Is it possible for one container to break another container running on the same host?
Yes and no, depending on. I mean, you could mount the same local volume into different containers, and they expect different things. Oh, for instance, Redis. If I tried once to with GlusterFS, I tried to scale a Redis container. The second one that it created freaked out because it's like there's already a PID file, and so it could not start. If you try to bind the same ports on a host by 2 different containers, usually the second one will fail to do so and crash, depending on which daemon you're running. So yeah, they can conflict if you use some of the host level connections. Further, you could, in theory, if you linked your containers, which is just a networking convenience, pretty much. It might also release some permissions, firewalling, I'm not sure, but at the very least it's a networking thing. You could, in theory, from one container send a SIG term to the other container or telnet into it on that dynamic host name or some other thing. So they can talk to each other, but you pretty much have to allow them to do so. You have to configure your containers, not your images, but your containers, to be able to do so in order to open something like that up to yourself.
Thank you.
Did you have a particular use case that
It was more out of the curiosity of protecting your. So if you develop a specific container and you want to make sure no way in hell is your container the thing that's breaking, like, is it possible that would be another container that you're borrowing from someone else that they have developed?
Yeah.
Or is it going to be specific to yours? So kind of like comparing it to a software like Vagrant, where things will be completely separated and there's no way in hell they're going to overlap 2 different Vagrants.
But with Vagrant, you've got the concept of shared mounted volumes and port binds, the same concept.
So it's if you allow it.
Yeah, if you open up those sorts of host level communication pathways, then you're opening yourself up to that sort of thing. Yeah.
And I think outside of the idea of volumes, you can bring it back to real life, I think, by saying your workplace. You can communicate with other computers on that network, much the same the containers can, in their kind of private virtual network. The volumes adds a little bit extra layer of, being careful.
Yeah, and the network voluming that I did took me forever to figure out, and it's super cool, way overkill. My applications are for like one clinic to use. We don't need to scale our applications up. So when I ship my applications, I'm going to volume mount, which just means the volume on the host is mapped to the volume on the container. And I'm never going to scale it up to more than one host. It's going to be one host for that client. I'm going to install a couple things on it, and that's it. So this is, I wanted to give you guys a really kind of a larger picture of what could be done with Docker. And in fact, really quickly, like insanely quickly, I found this container. Lector is what he said that they're doing at the Python group, right? So I know nothing about Python. I know nothing about this container.
On the 16th.
I'm just going to spin this up, and I'm going to, I don't know, I guess I'm going to port 8080. Oh, and I can actually see the Docker file. They're expecting you to hear on port 5000. So I'm going to map port 8080 on the host to 5000 in the container. I'm not going to work. What? Whoop. Hey, trackpad. Thank you. The only other thing that they're saying here, this is the Docker file for this image. It's apt-get update install. It installs curl, GCC, Python, and then it runs a Python bin of some variety, does a symlink, and then it curls getlector.com/install.sh and pipes it to sed to change something and pipes it to sh. Just installs it, sets a working directory and expose. I'm just going to run it and see what happens. And we'll have to see what host it's on. So it's on Rancher host 1. I said port 8080 is where it's going to be found. If this works, it'll be a great example of how you don't need to know anything about the underlying application or environment to get something running, similar to like the Elasticsearch and the entire Alk stack. And that's how we run GitLab. We actually are running GitLab in production, self-hosted GitHub, for those of you who don't know. Oh, bollocks. Oh, there it goes. Nope. It doesn't like something. Could not find project. So I guess I'd have to, I don't know. I don't know Lector. But this looks to me, this error looks like the console command, which is lector server --host 0.0.0.0. It's probably expecting you to be working inside of a present working directory with a Lector file system there. It was worth a shot, though. I'm so out of town. Sorry. Any other questions? In case you can't tell, I love talking, so come to Pat and Alley. Thank you.
All right.